From shearing fluffy sheep to harvesting ancient cork trees and trashing mountains of potatoes, farming isn't easy.
They work really long, hard hours.
This season, we dive into the big business of getting our food, wool, and even Christmas trees. Our first story takes us to Portugal, where these century-old trees produce the stoppers for some of our favorite drinks. Portugal produces about half of the world's cork wine stoppers. Most come from these trees, here in the Alentejo region. But harvesting a tree takes years of expertise and steady hands.
Há que ter paciência. Com varilhas, como a gente cá chama, que é dois homens, para se ajudarem um ao outro, com muito cuidado para não dar cabo das árvores.
We went inside the world's largest cork forest to see how Portugal produces 40 million cork stoppers a day. These are cork oak trees. They're so special. They've been protected under Portuguese law since 1209, so harvesters have strict rules to follow. The trees can't be touched for the first 15 years of their lives, and they can only be harvested every 9 years, so the bark has time to grow back in between. Since the first two harvests of a new tree don't produce the best cork, harvesters have to wait 33 years to get the good stuff. Every summer, harvesters peel off the bark using century-old techniques.
Sim, isto é machadas próprias para tirar a cortiça, já se experimentou com máquinas, as máquinas não dão, porque depois o homem tem que ir lá na mesma tirar a cortiça.
Only the outer layer can be harvested.
Normalmente, quando se aprende a tirar a cortiça, aprende-se que a primeira machadada que se dá no sobreiro tem que ser devagar, para ver a grossura da cortiça. É muito difícil, tem muita ciência para se tirar, para no fim as árvores não saírem feridas. E as árvores são feridas, normalmente começa a entrar umidade, começa a entrar bicho e com o passar dos anos elas vão acabar ou por cair ou por morrer.
To prevent that, workers leave the inner layer untouched.
We can harvest the bark of the tree without damaging the bark, so these cells can grow again without any impact in the life of the tree.
Because the trees regenerate, they'll never run out of cork. The oldest tree on record is an estimated 200 years old and has been harvested 20 times in its lifetime. After the cork planks are stripped from the trees, they're pressed between concrete slabs for 6 months. Then they're sent to a processing facility to be boiled for at least an hour. That's to sterilize the planks and make them softer. This machine punches out the stoppers we see in our wine bottles. Those corks are shipped out to 100 different countries. But the rest of the cork left behind in this process isn't wasted.
We don't waste anything, even the small residues.
All that byproduct can be made into things like flooring or granulated stoppers, used to cork less expensive wines. Cork harvesting goes back millennia. Egyptians used stoppers in tombs, and the Romans used cork in shoes. Today, Portugal harvests 100,000 tons of cork every year and owns a third of the cork oak forests in the world.
That is a real retainer of CO2, protected for biodiversity. This tree that separates the south of Europe and North Africa from the Sahara Desert, so it's a barrier to desertification.
Cork sustainability was part of what saved the Portuguese wine stopper. In the early 2000s, winemakers began turning to synthetic closures and screw tops for bottles, and the value of cork plummeted. But as consumers became more environmentally conscious in the 2010s,
the movement against single-use plastics that is happening all over the world, it's a real opportunity for cork.
Cork exports grew 52.3% in nearly a decade. In 2018, Portugal passed a record $1 billion worth of cork exports.
Exports, we kept that number and very close to 1.1 billion in 2019, and now we are waiting for the final numbers of 2020. But as a global pandemic, as a global crisis, we are expecting also some impact in our business.
Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2020 harvest didn't stop.
The cork harvest this year happened very smooth. We are talking about an activity that it's done at open air itself.
The industry's success in the last decade has allowed Portugal to take its cork products into other industries.
From construction to automotive industry, to aerospatial, to sports, fashion, clothes.
But even as cork demand continues to grow, harvesters plan to keep doing things the same way they always have, with a good axe. Next up, we're headed to New Zealand, home to thousands of sheep in need of a haircut. Here in the New Zealand countryside, 25,000 sheep are sheared in just 10 days.
It is a nightmare trying to keep the sheep still.
Just got kicked in the face.
But a good shearer can shear a sheep in a minute and the sheep won't even wriggle, it will just sit there.
This wool normally would be cleaned, dyed, woven, and sold across the globe as rugs and clothes. But due to a growing dependence on synthetic fabrics and a trade war with China, the value of wool has plummeted.
All of a sudden, a key revenue to their business has just disappeared overnight. And not only is the revenue gone, it's actually turned into a cost.
And it's left farmers like Andrew and Meredith with bales and bales of wool they can't sell.
Now farmers are basically giving it away or throwing it away.
So what happened? Back in the 1950s, wool was basically like gold in New Zealand.
Farmers would produce one clip of wool and be able to pay off a whole piece of land, like buy a farm outright. It was the golden era for farmers in New Zealand.
That's when Andrew's grandparents bought Ruanui Station here in Taihape, New Zealand.
I'm third generation. It's great to carry on what Dad and Granddad have slaved away at doing.
Andrew was working for his dad when the industry hit its peak in 1988, with wool exports valuing $1.9 billion. That made wool New Zealand's second biggest export after meat. Andrew took over the farm about 15 years ago, and since he's grown it to about 7,600 acres, raising 25,000 sheep.
Not a bad office when you get a view like this. It's blooming awesome, so quiet, especially this time of the day, it's beautiful.
Andrew raises Romney sheep. Their coarse wool has to be sheared twice a year for the sheep to stay healthy.
Without taking the wool off, they do get dags and sort of dirty bottoms and stuff like that, and that can attract flies. And if they attract flies, flies can actually land on them and lay their eggs. That will actually kill a sheep.
Also, think about how hot a New Zealand summer is. In 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that wool...
It's like wearing a great big furry jacket in the middle of the summer. If they're really, really woolly, when they lie down, they get stuck on their back and they actually can't stand up again and they die. Seriously.
In January, Andrew's staff heads out to round up sheep for the first shearing of the year.
Basically all the mustering's done on horseback, horse and dogs.
Using 20 horses, 4 ATVs, and 8 dogs, they gather up 3,600 sheep at a time.
They all have a couple of heading dogs and some hunaways. So the heading dogs are used for just heading the sheep and getting them going in the right direction, and the hunaways are the ones that bark and move the stock along. So it's all done on whistle command. We'll have a different whistle for left and right and stop and go. Got them heading the right way. They'll start coming around and joining up with the other lot.
They're all rounded up into this shed.
Last lot brought in from mustering. They'll be drafted into their different lines.
The sheep are separated into groups, lambs or babies, and adult ewes or female sheep.
We've got the ewe's wool here, 36 micron. It's a lot coarser and harder.
So it's best used for flooring, like carpets and rugs.
And then lamb's wool, which is 29 micron. It's a lot softer, finer.
So it's better for blankets and clothes. The sheep are each weighed and lined up for shearing. Andrew hired a gang of 8 contract shearers for the job.
We're under the shearing shed right now, which is pretty hot, noisy and dusty, and we're shearing about 2,000 sheep today.
The gang brings its own tools.
What you've got here is pretty much the same as what your barbers will have. We call this a cutter at the top and the comb at the bottom, which we put on every time. It's just scissor action that goes across.
One by one, Travis will pull a lamb out.
So you'll start off with the belly. It's the easiest way to get that out of the way, and then it's just a rhythm that you kind of want to do to get around the sheep, and it's a pattern. So you're basically just taking off as much wool as you can.
That cutter will last only about 15 minutes before it gets dull.
Sharpen the gear so you can get a clean cut on the sheep.
But don't worry, this doesn't hurt the sheep.
It is actually just a haircut for the sheep.
So you try and do every sheep the same. It makes it easier on your body as well. Makes the sheep comfortable. Making sure that they're in the best state when they go out, minimising nicks and controlling them properly.
It's a tough job. Shearing gangs work long hours in the heat, wrestling with livestock.
Oh, you're right? Did you get a kick in the nose?
It is a nightmare trying to keep the sheep still. They kick and wriggle and stuff like that. A good shearer could shear a sheep in like 1 minute, and to watch them do it is amazing. They are so fast.
The more you do it, the more experienced you are, but at the start it's never easy. It takes a big toll on your body and mind.
These guys are so good at taming sheep, they can shear over 300 in a day. Rousies gather up the fleece, and pressers squish it into huge bales.
200 kilos a bale.
In 2015, Andrew would have sold his stock quickly, for $7 a kilo. But today,
I was just talking to the wool broker last night. He sort of came back with this $1.20. I'm thinking, oh God, this is not great.
when you add in the increasing costs of shearer contracts, it's now more expensive to shear the sheep than the wool is actually worth.
My farm 5 years ago, we might have been making net cost $50,000 or $60,000 revenue. So it's gone from making 50 to costing 30. So it's an $80,000 a year change.
It's soul destroying to see the wool prices so low when it's the most amazing natural product.
So why is the wool worth so little? Well, demand is way down because a few decades ago, cheaper synthetic fabrics began replacing coarse wool in flooring products. Wool is biodegradable, sustainable, and fire-resistant, but it's expensive.
To be honest, the average person can't afford 100% wool carpets.
Synthetic rugs are made of plastic fiber, so they're harmful for the environment and are highly flammable, but they're a third of the price. And their growing popularity took a huge swing at wool's demand. Then things got rocky with New Zealand's biggest customer. 60% of New Zealand's wool goes to China. Andrew and Meredith sold all of their lamb's wool to clothing factories there.
We do have a hell of a lot of our eggs in the Chinese basket.
That proved to be a bad bet for New Zealand.
They come in and they buy and they buy and they stop, so our wool prices dive.
In 2016, China first pulled back its demand for coarse wool, and the price tumbled. In 2019, the Trump administration slapped China with fresh tariffs on textiles sold in the US. Struggling to sell its manufactured wool clothes in the US, China slowed its orders for New Zealand wool.
That can cause all sorts of problems in supply chains and markets, because all of a sudden you've got your major customer not wanting it.
Then in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic closed down clothing factories in China. Andrew and Meredith were stuck with bales of wool. So like many farmers in New Zealand, they stockpiled it, waiting for prices to go back up.
But it can only be kept for about a year before it starts to deteriorate.
But a year into this pandemic, and prices still haven't rebounded. Stockpiling didn't work. Some farmers were forced to throw away part of their wool stock. Others had to get creative. Meredith found Tracy. Tracy takes the lamb's wool Meredith couldn't sell and converts it into throw blankets.
These are the throws that we're manufacturing for her. To try and give them some added value to their fibre by getting it processed into yarn and then processing it into throws, which then they can sell for a high margin.
Workers in Wellington clean and dye the wool and then send it to Tracy.
When the wool arrives, we then warp it, we then weave it. You'd probably need to allocate 1 kilo per throw.
Workers inspect and mend each throw by hand. The blankets are then cleaned, raised, meaning fluffed up, and then packaged. Even though there's growing interest for these throws online, it's barely made a dent in Andrew and Meredith's losses. Tracy only buys their lamb's wool, but the majority of Andrew and Meredith's output is coarse wool, which is still caught up in trade wars. To weather this storm, some farmers are turning to breeds that shed their own wool to avoid those rising shearing costs. Others are pivoting to meat production or selling their farms to forestry and getting out of sheep farming altogether.
It would be a huge economic negative for our country if we saw the wool industry disappear.
What's left is a once booming wool industry on the brink.
We've seen that sheep flock go from 70 million to today we're about 22 million.
We're the last wool weaver in New Zealand. There used to be a scouring plant almost in every town.
Farmers are hoping to expand exports outside of volatile China and convince consumers of the benefits of wool over synthetic.
A lot of consumers are now really starting to think about what's in the products they're buying and prepared to pay more for natural, environmentally friendly products.
And Tom says the industry needs to diversify.
You're not just dependent on a floor. You can put wool through the whole house. You can put wool through the whole office as well.
Wool can be used in sofas, beds, drapes, upholstery, and even insulation.
Well, we're pretty nervous, really, to be honest, yeah. And I think if we had a crystal ball, that would be fantastic, but nobody knows where things are headed.
For now, Andrew and Meredith aren't abandoning the industry just yet.
At the end of the day, you've still got to shear the wool off them, and that may as well be worth something. So we'll hang in there and see whether we can
ride the roller coaster.
So how many have you named?
No, they're not pets. Haven't named any of them.
On the other side of the world, these farmers are being forced to throw away their livelihoods because of the pandemic. These potatoes aren't going to end up on your dinner table. Their final destination is this hole. We're in the small town of Sheridan, Montana, on a potato farm. Normally, this time of year, Bill and Peggy would be sending their potatoes to be planted. Instead, they're throwing away 700 tons.
The potatoes have been awful good to us for a lot of years, but this year it just really turned sour.
And the same thing is happening across the Northwest.
I mean, it was just unprecedented. It's the supply chain from the growers to the supermarket that got interrupted.
More than half of our market shut down by government mandate.
Now, farmers across Idaho and Montana are stuck with mountains of potatoes. So why did this all happen? We visited Bouillon Ranch, where Peggy and Bill have been growing potato seed for 59 years. Normally, potato production across the Northwest looks like this. It starts with a seed grower like Bouillon, where farmers grow a variety of seed strains.
Virtually all the potatoes grown started out from a certified seed, and that's a fairly rigorous process that avoids disease, imperfections.
Bouillon grows 3 different disease-free seed strains: Umatilla, Clearwater, and Russet Burbank potatoes. Each potato variety goes to a specific grower in either the fresh or processed segment. In the fresh segment,
you're actually seeing the potato in its true form.
That's foods like a raw potato at a grocery store or au gratin potatoes at your favorite restaurant.
The other side of that is, we call it our process segment. You don't actually see the potato, you see the byproduct or the end result of that.
That's the bag of potato chips, the French fries at McDonald's, or the pre-cut fries in the frozen section.
If you're a fresh product grower, you'll plant a different variety or a different genetic line of potatoes. If you're a process grower, you'll grow a different product line. Just some fry better, they have a better color to them, others grow better.
Now back to the farm. Potato growers get the seed from Bouillon and start planting in March. Then they harvest in early fall. Once the potatoes are out of the ground, they go into storage or are sent to a factory, where they're cleaned and turned into either fresh or processed potatoes.
When COVID hit, we had a huge run on retail, which lasted for about a week to 2 weeks. But then when we shut off all the restaurants, that's when everything came out of kilter.
Potatoes for food service, like restaurants, hotels, and catering, make up an estimated 55% of all potato crops.
Think of everything from white table restaurants clear down to your fast quick service.
So when food service establishments shut down because of COVID-19, it was a chain effect. Processors cut down orders with growers. Out of options, the growers cut their orders with seed farmers. And more than half of the industry's potatoes were stranded on seed farms. In Peggy's case, her customers in Washington were cut back more than 50%, and she and Bill were stuck with tons of seed they'd normally sell.
You can't take some of these facilities that are built directly for food service and then tomorrow flip a switch and make them able to sell into retail. You're asking a square peg in a round hole, I guess, is the best analogy I can come up with.
The surplus potatoes also couldn't just be sent to grocery stores.
Grocery stores or retails would have been bursting at the seams with potatoes if we redirected all that.
We had high hopes and maybe something would turn up, that in a month or so we might be able to send them somewhere for some kind of processing. But this year's, there's just no market for them. We're just taking them out, taking them into a burial pit.
Peggy and Bill have been forced to bury 1.4 million pounds of potatoes in total.
It's costing us money just to bury these. I mean, between our time and labor and renting a large excavator to dig the hole and cover them, it's not free just to throw them away to us. It's an expense just to get rid of them.
When you dump that many potatoes, the financial hit.
Yeah.
I mean, that was what's so heart-sickening, is the financial burden.
It takes a tremendous amount of capital to grow a crop of potatoes. Bankruptcies are starting to creep up.
Before the pandemic, Zach estimates Idaho farmers were looking at a 15-year high in potato prices. Now they're facing a 20-year low. Zach says a 100-pound sack of potatoes went from costing about $12 a sack to $3 a sack, and a farmer needs it to cost at least $5 to break even. Peggy and Bill are facing $140,000 in losses. For farmers across Idaho and Montana, that number comes to $8 million.
Some of these farmers are looking at red all over their balance sheet and there's no black to be seen. They'll be
looking into increasing their lines of credit. They'll be needing to remortgage some of their property, just trying to free up more capital to try and survive for next year.
When you put all your work and effort into growing them and the expense and the pride of what you grow, and then to just completely just throw it away and waste it.
To save some of the potatoes from going to waste, Bouillon Ranch got creative. Peggy and Bill have given out roughly 75,000 pounds of potatoes to the surrounding community.
She's organized 2 or 3 giveaway days, and we've had pickups from 100 miles away. People come and got potatoes. She's distributed them down on our street in town, just set up, and people stop, they give them a bag of potatoes. And just to try to get somebody benefit from them.
Even though they're losing money on them, they'd rather see someone eat them than nothing happen at all.
Farmers are also mashing up potatoes into a compost-like mixture to feed cattle next year.
We've put them into this pile and mixed straw. Then we're going to put plastic over the top of it and let it get totally broke down by next fall. At that point, if everything is okay and the rations, then we'll start feeding the calves with them. It's money out of our pocket, trying to find another use of the spuds.
But all of that effort barely made a dent in the number of stranded potatoes.
Right now, it's like 200,000, roughly in there with everything, I would say. It's pretty devastating, for a small operation for us.
All in all, an estimated 1.5 billion pounds of potatoes are trapped in the supply chain across the U.S.
If I was advising a year ago, not knowing what was going to happen, I wouldn't have told them to do anything differently than they did now. If we'd have anticipated COVID wrong and had a short crop, a very small crop, it would have been devastated to food hunger. We'd have had mass shortage of potatoes, and that would have been even worse.
Luckily, Zach says all this food waste won't lead to a shortage next year. Farmers are still planting potatoes, just not as much.
Going forward this year, I think the farmers are doing the right thing.
We thought, let's plant what we do and take the risk.
We already had the ground prepared, and we raise most of our own seed and buy some. So you might as well just carry on. I guess that's kind of the farm and ranch. Bad years, you just start over the next year and hope for a better season. If you didn't, you'd have quit a long time ago.
But that's the plight of a farmer. We're always looking for next year. Farmers farm for the love of farming, and even in tough times, we still will continue to farm for the love of farming.
The pandemic didn't just threaten America's supply of potatoes, it also came after its meat. When coronavirus outbreaks shut down meat processing plants across the U.S., animals headed here were suddenly stranded here.
As time has gone on and plants haven't been able to operate, that's created a big backlog of pigs.
With nowhere to send their pigs, some farmers were forced to euthanize their herds.
You're literally talking about millions and millions of pigs that were intended to go to market but are still remaining on the farm.
The backup at farms led to record-breaking meat prices and cleared out shelves. The U.S. was in the midst of a meat shortage.
You start with the ethics of it, like animals live and die to make your product, and then you get to the concentration of it. It's a pretty hairy beast.
But why did this all happen? And how can we avoid it from happening in the future? America is the world's leading producer of beef and poultry. It's also one of the top producers of pork in the world. In the U.S. alone, an estimated 9 billion animals are slaughtered a year. In order to process all that meat, the industry is efficient and concentrated. Simply put, as many animals as possible move from the farm to the slaughterhouse as quickly as possible. When the system works, U.S. meat prices are among the most affordable on the planet, but that efficiency becomes a problem in the face of COVID-19. For one, workers operate in tight quarters.
They're in refrigerated environments with recirculating air. This was an environment in which COVID could apparently be spread easily from worker to worker.
An estimated 25,000 meatpacking workers have contracted COVID-19, and outbreaks in 167 plants forced 38 in South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa to close. Since only a small number of plants handle most of the industry's meat,
When any one of them closes, it has an impact on the entire industry.
It's like the only store shut down in town and you can't get milk, right? If you're a farmer.
By early May, beef and pork plants were running at about 40% below the processing volumes we saw just a year ago. So that's an enormous reduction in processing volumes and caused all kinds of disruptions.
this has hit farmers like Mike hard.
When COVID started really impacting the plants, our percentage of utilization of the plants just kind of kept going down and down and down. That's created a real backlog of pigs.
Every year, Mike and his co-op send about 150,000 hogs to the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. But when COVID-19 closed that plant, they had nowhere to send their animals.
We got our letter April 11th that the Smithfield plant was going to be closed. Turned out to be 4 weeks that they didn't receive any hogs in Sioux Falls.
Remember, the meat industry is streamlined to be exact.
We're looking for a very uniform end product. Last ones are 284. These might be, I think they're going to be pretty close to that. Okay. It's real similar.
All the pigs Mike, or any farmer, sends to a plant have to weigh about 280 pounds.
If it gets above 300, 330 pounds, the plants are just not configured to take animals of that size.
Mike tried to put them on a diet.
Right now it's just basically ground corn. There's some vitamins and minerals and salt in there. Now usually we would have soybean meal, dried distiller's grains from the ethanol process in there as well, but those feeds are more expensive and we were trying to slow their growth. This diet should slow them down to about 1 pound a day, and where usually they're gaining 2.5 pounds a day at this stage.
But even on a diet, they were growing beyond the 280-pound mark by the day. It was a no-win scenario. They had shipments of baby pigs still coming in from nursing farms. They were running out of space and feed. The current pigs were getting too fat, and factories were still closed.
Last case situation is unfortunately where farmers have to consider euthanizing some animals.
Combined, Mike's cooperative has had to euthanize over 3,400 pigs.
About $500,000 worth.
But Mike estimates if you add in the feed costs, the loss for his co-op is upwards of $1.5 million.
I don't know that it's even possible to compare the economic losses to sort of the psychological impact that this has on producers. Neither one are positive. It's really kind of a double whammy, I think.
The situation Mike's co-op faced was happening all over the country.
So one way to think about it is like this. In this country, we have a processing capacity of about 500,000 pigs per day.
Remember, the industry was running at about 40% below capacity.
If you do the math, every day that's an extra 200,000 pigs that were meant to go to market but instead stayed on the farm. So you do that for 5 days, which happened. That's 1 million extra pigs that were going to go to market.
After a couple of weeks, that's millions of pigs at risk of being euthanized. All of this is why consumers have seen higher meat prices and those empty shelves, which Jason estimates may stretch out for at least another 6 months. Since mid-May, things have started getting better. Factories like Smithfield, Sioux Falls have reopened, with limited production and social distancing measures. Euthanization of animals has slowed, and as a result, production and meat prices have started to stabilize. But what can we do so this doesn't happen again? One option is to rely more on smaller, vertically integrated farms.
When you see a piece of meat in the grocery store, it's typically been touched by 15 or 20 different types of companies. And all of those companies are hyper-specialized and they operate at a really efficient scale.
That's Anya. She owns Belcampo Farms, a vertically integrated meat company out in Northern California.
Our supply chain relies entirely on our own infrastructure. We own our own farms, our own slaughterhouse, and several direct-to-consumer businesses.
Belcampo's home to 3,000 grass-fed organic cattle. They have 30,000 acres to roam and live 7 to 10 times longer than conventional cattle. The slaughtering process is also slowed down, with only 50 to 60 animals processed a day in a slaughterhouse that Belcampo owns, just 20 minutes from the farm.
I think of it as like intentional inefficiency.
And because Belcampo exists outside of the normal meat industry,
we're not reliant on the broader meat infrastructure. Since we have our own slaughterhouse that we've had extremely aggressive and proactive safety measures in, we have not had any issues.
This also made it easier for Anya to start social distancing measures in the plant before the CDC required it.
We implemented mandatory temp checking and a questionnaire every day as of March 18th.
Direct-to-consumer models could be another shakeup in the industry, cutting out distribution centers. Anya's e-commerce site saw unprecedented traffic, and her app, delivering meat to homes in San Francisco and LA,
went from 3,000 to 20,000 users in the past month.
As for the bigger meat companies at the heart of this issue, Jason has a few ideas. More medium-sized plants for starters, so if one goes down, it doesn't take the whole supply chain with it.
Even if you're one of the large processors, you may think about giving up some of that economies of scale to maybe reduce some risks.
But Jason says the most effective change would be
Automation.
robots don't get sick.
It's just hard. We're not putting together car parts that are uniform in shape and size. Animals are different sizes, shapes, weights.
But whether or not the meat industry will make any of these changes comes down to what the consumers demand and how much they're willing to pay for any real changes.
It's been a choice we've been making with our wallets for years, where we love cheap protein. Our customer is going to pay up for a secure supply chain. And I think that the more we talk about it, the more people are going to raise their hands and say, I'm opting out.
From pig pens to oyster cages, our next stop takes us underwater.
These cages contain more than 30 million oysters. They are grown here at one of the largest oyster farms on the East Coast. But these little guys are hard to cultivate. They need constant care, or else an entire crop can get wiped out.
It's kind of a good mixture of science and heavy labor. So it's hard work, long hours, it's 7 days a week.
And the work doesn't stop there. After the oysters are harvested, it's a race against time to get them safely to consumers. We went inside Ward Oyster Company to see how it harvests 3.5 million oysters every year, bringing them from algae tanks to your plate. This is John Vigliata. He began his career on the water when he was 13 years old.
I started putting oysters in cages in 1995.
This aquaculture farm sprawls over 884 acres, the size of over 147 Roman Colosseums. It includes a hatchery, nursery, and part of Virginia's Mobjack Bay. Farming an oyster begins in the hatchery. Here, biologist Chris Smith puts 3,000 adult oysters into a shallow tank called a spawning table. Then, he artificially creates the conditions that cause oysters to spawn.
We're controlling the temperature in the tank specifically. It's the all-you-can-eat buffet, getting them ready to spawn.
When the oysters spawn, they release their eggs and sperm directly into the water. The eggs and sperm are put into tanks, where they turn into oyster larvae. 1 billion oyster babies are produced in these tanks every year. They remain there for about 3 weeks, feeding on algae and growing shells.
We grow about 7 different species of algae to create a menu for our oysters and clams. It's amazing to see the algae kind of bloom and then to watch the oysters and clams grow in our facility. It's very gratifying.
When the oysters get to be about a 1/4 inch long, they are placed outside in upweller tanks.
And it's a system in which allows a large quantity of water to be flown past the oysters, giving them a superabundant amount of food.
After about 2 months of feeding, staff check on the size of the oysters.
We'll take these oysters here that are larger and they'll go in a cage to go overboard. And then these oysters here will go back into the system for a further grow out to where they can get to be this size and eventually go in a cage.
The cages full of oysters are then tossed into the Mobjack Bay.
We have about 2,500 to 3,000 cages. Contained in all the cages that we have out in the Mobjack Bay, you probably have somewhere around 30 million oysters.
That is a lot of oysters. If all of them were harvested at once and put into your freezer, you could eat over 800 oysters every day for 100 years. And you would still have leftovers.
Nicely done.
Farmers monitor the weather closely. Excessive rainfall can dilute the salt in the water, which could kill the oysters. And water temperature is also a factor.
Oysters grow best between 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 80 degrees. If you go above that, it just gets so hot that they will stop growing or slow down significantly. If it goes below that, they go dormant.
If all goes well, after 6 months, the cages are removed from the water and the oysters are brought to a separator. This machine sorts them by size. If they are not big enough to sell, they go back in the water. Oysters can take around 1 to 2 years to go from hatchery to market. After separation, market-sized oysters are washed, tagged with order information, and boxed. Once the oysters come out of the bay, the clock starts ticking. The team has to harvest the oysters, transport them to the shop, add ice, package them, and place them in the cooler within 2 hours to meet FDA guidelines. The boxes are put into a refrigerated truck and shipped to distributors across the U.S., who pay around 40 cents per oyster. In Virginia, wild-caught oysters actually sell for less, around 30 cents.
We probably sell our market oysters to 10 or 15 different states in the country, but our oysters end up everywhere.
And occasionally, for local orders, John delivers himself.
Gotcha. And then you have the tag here.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay.
Customers say that they're fresh, they're delicious.
Since 1996, they've gone from farming 100,000 oysters per year to 3.5 million in 2019. Besides selling oysters to eat, the company also sells around 70 million baby oysters each year to farmers up and down the East Coast. Aquaculture is one of the fastest growing food production sectors in the world. While the amount of seafood caught in the wild has not increased by much since the 1980s, demand is up nearly 150%. Aquaculture is filling the gap. It is predicted that by 2030, 60% of the fish available for human consumption will come from aquaculture. Virginia has made a big bet and doubled down on farming oysters. Today, the state is the largest oyster producer on the East Coast. But the pandemic has hurt business.
Like no natural disaster that we've ever had.
Oysters' market value and restaurant orders plummeted.
So we're getting hit both with reduced orders and a reduced price for the product that we do sell.
And on top of that, after a stellar 2019, John stocked the bay, hoping for an abundant future.
We have a record amount of product in the water, and our sales are off almost 50%.
While 2020 was a roller coaster ride for Ward Oyster Company, sales have finally started to pick up. John is optimistic about the future. No matter what happens, he plans to be on the water.
I love being out on the water. My office is on the water. You can't get it much better than that. And salt water is in my veins.
Our last stop takes us to New York, where the city's most magical Christmas tree was found in someone's front yard. The iconic Rockefeller tree didn't come from a Christmas tree farm. It came from someone's backyard, here in Oneonta, New York. This year's tree is an 80-year-old Norway spruce, found in Al Dick's yard.
Tree's 75 feet tall, 45 feet wide, and about 11 tons. I found this tree back in 2016.
The head gardener for Rockefeller Center happened to be riding down the road and he saw the tree.
Eric stopped by Al's general store to see if Al and his family would donate their tree to Rockefeller Center.
He asked me if we could do it, and we said sure, but they had to wait a few years.
It wasn't tall enough when they first saw it.
It wasn't tall enough, they had to grow a little.
I've been looking at it for a couple years. I watered it, I fed it over a couple years, and then this summer when I came by, it just looked great and it looked perfect, and it was the year to take it.
When the spruce was unveiled as the 2020 tree, the Rockefeller team got to work protecting and preparing it.
We had a 24-hour-a-day guards.
Eric especially, he's been here every day. There's been like family, we're gonna miss them being outside every day.
But getting this massive spruce to the center of Manhattan is no easy task. First, it had to come out of the ground.
We came up and we started tying it. It took us all the way to Saturday afternoon.
Eric hired a crew of local workers to tie up the branches. That's to make sure they're secure through the cutting and the drive.
And then the crane came and we built the crane and put the counterweights on it so that it could hold the tree.
The crane is already attached to the tree when the workers begin cutting. Eric and his team have private property and bystanders to think about. It takes only a few minutes to saw through the massive trunk, leaving the giant tree hanging in the air.
Now we moved it over to the truck.
The tree is laid on its side on that 115-foot long trailer and strapped into place.
The tree is going to take a nice little trip down to New York City.
Often the most complicated part is getting it right from the property where it is onto the highway.
What is normally a 3.5-hour drive takes up to 3 days with a 75-foot tree.
You don't want to get the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree stuck in traffic. And then, of course, the city of New York is always tremendously helpful with us in terms of closing the streets and making sure that we're able to have a smooth arrival into the city.
Normally, the tree arrives to big crowds. But this year, because of COVID-19, it pulled up to an empty Rockefeller Center.
We like to think that Tree Arrival Day is the start of the holiday season officially in New York. And certainly this has been a year unlike any other, so it felt all the more important to us to continue those traditions.
Carefully, it's lifted off the truck, then tilted right side up and slid into the sturdy tree stand in the middle of Rockefeller Center.
As if putting up the tree in Rockefeller Plaza is not enough.
Crews working on the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree got a little surprised.
They found a tiny owl.
This year, workers found a little owl hidden inside the tree, and the bird went viral as people guessed it hitched a ride all the way from upstate New York. He was brought safely to a shelter and named appropriately Rockefeller, Rocky for short. Also blowing up the internet, the fact that the tree looked a little bare on arrival. But what might look like a scrawny tree now got a big facelift.
This is the extension to make it nice and full.
Over the next couple of weeks, the tree was surrounded in scaffolding. As the tree's branches settled and fluffed out, it's been reported workers also attached branch extensions to make the tree appear fuller.
We stick a hole in the tree, put the branch back in,
boom,
wire it in, boom.
Like a weave. Like a weave.
Like a weave. It's just like a weave.
Then they draped 50,000 LED lights around it and topped it with a 900-pound Swarovski crystal star. And finally, on December 2nd, the Rockefeller Christmas tree is lit up, this year through a virtual ceremony.
The tree is always real. Come, you can smell it, you can see it. This year we probably won't let you touch it thanks to COVID, but I can assure you it is a very real tree. We have the pine cones to prove it.
And when it's all over,
we take the lumber when it is done and we donate to Habitat for Humanity, and it turns into homes for the future.
It's going to be a rough season for some.
At least the tree didn't get killed.
We'll go in the history books, right?
Yeah, there you go.